The Prime Minister insists the latest round of airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen were in response to an ongoing imminent threat. The UK and US carried out their second joint operation on the rebels last night. They hit 8 targets, including an underground storage site. The Houthis have described the action as a strategic mistake and vowed to retaliate. The conflict erupted after the Iran-backed military group started targeting ships which they believe are linked to Israel and the West in the Red Sea in response to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Delivering an update to the House of Commons this afternoon, Rishi Sunak insisted the UK is not seeking confrontation, but will not hesitate to act again if necessary.
At my order overnight, the RAF engaged in a second wave of strikes against Houthi military targets in Yemen. We did so because we continue to see, including in intelligence, an ongoing and imminent threat from the Houthis to UK commercial and military vessels and to those of our partners in the Red Sea and wider region. I told the House last week that we would not hesitate to respond if the acts continue in order to protect innocent lives and preserve the freedom of navigation. And that is what we have done. We acted alongside the United States with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada and the Netherlands. We acted on the same basis as the 11th of January, fully in line with international law, in self-defence and in response to a persistent threat. And as with the first wave, the strikes were limited to carefully selected targets with maximum care taken to protect civilian lives.
Joining me in the studio now, TalkTV's political correspondent Alicia Fitzgerald. Good to see you, Alicia. And down the line, we're joined by Professor in Security Studies, Dr Andreas Kreig, and Edmund Fitton-Brown, the former UK ambassador to Yemen. May I start with you, Edmund, if you wouldn't mind? You're the person who spent most time in Yemen. You will know just how powerful the Houthis are, exactly what it is, or maybe it's not quite clear exactly what it is they're trying to achieve. In fact, we had Dr Chris Parry, Admiral Dr Chris Parry, on earlier, and he said that what they want to do is increase their profile. Is that, do you think, part of their motivation?
I think there's something in that, yes. You ask how powerful they are. They control the most populous parts of Yemen. They've been the most successful side in the Yemeni civil war. And of course, they want more power. In that respect, they are still engaged in discussions with Saudi Arabia about possibly achieving a ceasefire, which would allow Saudi Arabia to exit its engagement in that war and probably give the Houthis more power in terms of their own control in Yemen. And then profile, yes, they do want profile. They've used the Red Sea for this before, and they have attacked shipping before. They want some notoriety. They are long-standing haters of Israel and of Jews. And they've chosen this opportunity to seize the world's headlines.
One of the things we found out on the programme today is the average age of the population of Yemen and the fact that there are obviously young people there, particularly young men, with no means of finding any gainful employment, with an enormous amount of youthful energy, and that if they sign up to join the Houthi rebels, they earn, I think it's $20 a week. If they sign up to Hamas, they earn $100 a week. Is that right?
And I couldn't verify the sums, but the principle is absolutely true. We've seen that this be the case in many places. There was a time in Afghanistan where recruitment between the Taliban and ISIL Khorasan was partly contested by who could pay greater wages. And when the Houthis first swept across Yemen in 2014 and had their signal military successes that led to them taking over the capital, Sana'a, they were able to recruit people who were not from the Zaydi sect that they come from, but they simply people who were looking for an opportunity to earn money.
Dr Andreas Kreig, would you mind explaining a little bit more about the Houthis, about what it is they're aiming to do and about whether they have the means by which to do it?
Good afternoon. I mean, as the ambassador already said, the Houthis are a militia, very much a network of different actors, very decentralized in many ways, which makes them very difficult to control. They've been around for over 20 years, been fighting the war for a minority in Yemen's conflict in Yemen's north. Fairly successful as an insurgent group in the mountainous areas, but as the ambassador already said, they've taken over the Sana'a capital nearly 10 years ago, and have been fighting fairly successfully as Yemen was kind of in a state, it has been in a constant state of decay since the Arab Spring. And obviously consecutive US and UK governments have kind of failed to bring about some sort of stability or have a strategy for stability in Yemen. And the Houthis are probably the number one victor, if you will, the benefactor of that instability. And they've been able to exploit that instability to kind of advance their rule and create an authoritarian regime in the north of Yemen that now is, has nothing to lose. And to be honest, they are a militia with part of a state. And the problem here is that a militia in itself, even if they were losing ground and territory, and even if they lost some support, which they're not at the moment, quite on the contrary, they can sustain it. They're an extremely resilient network of different actors, which makes them very, very difficult to strike. And we've seen that over a decade of strikes from an Arab-led coalition, a Saudi-led coalition, have not really made them any more malleable or any more open to dialogue. Quite on the contrary, we've seen that they're usually bogged down. They're usually not very responsive to deterrence or to coercion. And hence why these kind of airstrikes could be seen as a major escalation from a Houthi point of view. And it's unlikely going to bring the sort of results that we need.
Let me bring Edmund Fitton-Brown back into this conversation. You heard Andreas Kreig there say that part of what's happened here is because US and UK governments didn't take whatever the appropriate measures might have been to curb the rise of the Houthi. And you were part of the government as their ambassador. So is Andreas Kreig, your fellow guest on this programme, right about what he says? And could the British government have done more or done something differently in order to curb the rise and rise?
I don't think there's much that the British government could have done in that respect. I mean, if you think about it, the Houthis had been fighting against the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh for years before the Arab Spring. And Ali Abdullah Saleh had tried to put them down, and he hadn't been able to do it. So we used to talk about, the fifth Houthi war and the sixth Houthi war. So they are, I do completely agree that they are effective and resilient fighters. What we tried to do back in those days, sort of from 2011 through until the civil war really went completely pear-shaped in 2014, was to encourage a national dialogue that was taking place in Yemen. And there was a certain amount of optimism around that because the Yemenis brought forward ideas to manage the interests of the various parts of the country. And there was, you will recall, a lot of optimism and enthusiasm about the possibility of more consultative and responsive government in the Middle East region. And Yemen was actually one of the more optimistic cases for a little while. But unfortunately, in the end, you can't force a country not to fight with itself. And I mean, there were very, very strong tendencies in Yemen towards civil war. And Ali Abdullah Saleh did not accept that he had been sidelined from Yemen, and he allied with the Houthis and then attacked his successor, President Hadi. I don't think anybody could have done much about that. The Saudis, of course, tried very hard and invested very heavily with their allies from the UAE and from other regional countries to try to support the legitimate government against the Houthis. But the Houthis are good fighters. And by the way, I think it's really important to say that when we talk about airstrikes at the moment, we should listen to what the Prime Minister is saying. These are not strikes on Yemen. These are proportionate efforts to degrade the Houthi capability to threaten the freedom of navigation through the Red Sea. And in that respect, I think they have every chance of success. I don't think that the Houthis will stop trying to hit shipping in the Red Sea, but I think their ability to do it is being progressively degraded.
Let me see whether Dr. Andreas Kreig agrees with that. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, overall, yes. I mean, the issue has been, it's a very difficult multipolar conflict. I mean, the Houthis are one part of a wider conflict. What is absurd, though, is that for years and years, UK, US, and other Western countries have put pressure on the Saudis to stop the war, engage in dialogue, retreat from war, and seek a diplomatic route out of the conflict. They've done so. And now it's the Saudis turning it around and saying we kind of asked the UK and the US to exercise restraint. The problem that we have is that we have to see this in the context of UK and US wider networks in the region and wider partnerships. The problem is, yes, the Bahrainis are on board, but not only by name. The bigger problem is that countries like Saudi, UAE, and Qatar are not on board. I mean, they've engaged in a dialogue with the Iranians themselves. They don't want to be seen as complicit in this, because also they see this conflict not just about the freedom of navigation, but they're seeing it as part of the war in Gaza. And I think this is also something we mustn't forget. I mean, this is about, from the Houthi perspective, it is about an element of trying to restrain and punish Israel. And now what we're doing is we're punishing the Houthis for punishing Israel, instead of actually looking at the root cause of that, current escalation in the Red Sea. And I think this is about Gaza. So we also have to be seen as doing more. We also need to do more in engaging our partners in the Gulf. And here, I think what is key is, I completely agree with Ambassador, we're not at war with Yemen. We are not trying to fight the Houthis. Obviously, that's not how the Houthis are seeing it. But we need to engage in dialogue. And the only partner that we have, and the most important partner there is for anyone, but particularly for the UK, is Oman. Oman is the only country that has a direct relationship with the Houthis, that can engage in dialogue, that can open and keep back channels open with the Houthis, to kind of demonstrate to them that, A, we're only there to deter them through punishment. We're not there to erode, or annihilate the Houthis from Yemen. But I'm very doubtful that with these targeted airstrikes, you're actually able to achieve anything, considering what this arsenal that the Houthis have is. I mean, it's a massive arsenal. And many of these anti-ship missiles that they have constructed with the help of Iran are being built on the ground with Iranian help. And the Iranians have kept these supply chains to Yemen open, despite all the war, despite all the naval blockades against Yemen. They have been able to maintain them open. So I think it's a Sisyphonian sort of operation where you never get to where you want to get to. Every strike that will destroy some capacity and capability will lead to more capability being created.
I'm going to bring Alyssa in just 1 minute to discuss the current political situation in this country, but I give Edmund Fitton-Brown a chance to respond to what Andreas Kreig has just said about, the fact that it might escalate, which is frightening for the rest of the world and frightening for all of us, but also that it might not do any good, that this kind of retaliation and reprisal and followed by more of the same doesn't really achieve a great deal. Do you think it could escalate matters, and do you think it could be futile anyway?
Well, first of all, I don't think it will escalate things, because at the moment I don't detect an Iranian appetite for it to escalate, because I think they're happy enough to see the Houthis do what they're doing, but I don't think the Iranians have the Houthis' backs completely. The second point I'd like to make is that we haven't seen an attack as developed or as concentrated as the one that took place just one day before the US and the UK took action. So you can argue that the evidence so far is that although the Houthis are able to continue to harass, they're not as successful in, they haven't been able to disable or sink a ship. And therefore, I think we would have to suspend judgment on the strikes being unsuccessful. I think it may well be that the Houthi capability has been degraded. And one last thing I must say about Saudi Arabia is, of course, we have excellent close consultation with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a very difficult line to walk here. Of course, it's in a war with the Houthis from which it would like to disengage. And it also doesn't want to appear to be, a high-profile opponent of another Arab entity at a time when there is so much high feeling about Gaza and Israel. But the Americans have such close relations with the Saudis, as do the UK, and undoubtedly they cleared their lines with Riyadh and with Cairo. So you don't get public support because you don't want to embarrass your friends in the region by forcing them to say things that will cause them problems with their own constituencies. But I think you may be sure that the Egyptians and the Saudis are, in fact, both on board with this operation.